Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbor, not just any neighbor but the self-appointed HOA queen, standing on your lawn measuring your grass with a ruler. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that was just the beginning. What started as a petty complaint about a harmless garden gnome quickly spiraled into a full-blown war. A battle of fake violations, trespassing, secret recordings, and even a 911 call. But here's the best part. Karen never saw the karma coming. By the end of this story, she would lose everything she worked so hard to control. And trust me, you won't want to miss how it all goes down. Hello, beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. It was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Lined with pristine sidewalks, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses that looked like they'd been copied and pasted straight out of a suburban catalog. It was the kind of place where people waved politely but mostly kept to themselves. Well, except for Karen. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the defender of the HOA rules, and the ultimate enforcer of all things she deemed proper. Armed with a clipboard, an attitude bigger than her backyard, and an uncanny ability to appear whenever someone dared to break an imaginary rule, she ruled the block with an iron fist. She first came for me over something small. A single harmless garden gnome. I had placed it near my flower bed. Nothing outrageous, nothing neon, nothing that played music or flashed lights. Just a simple little gnome standing there minding its own business. But apparently to Karen, it was a violation of everything sacred. I heard the distinct sound of her sandals clacking on the pavement before I even saw her. There she was, standing on my driveway, hands on her hips, lips pursed in disapproval. You know, she said, her voice dripping with the faux politeness of someone who lived for confrontation. This isn't in line with the HOA guidelines. I glanced at the gnome, then back at her. Pretty sure it is. She huffed. Well, it's an eyesore. We like to keep a certain aesthetic here. I looked around. A few houses had flamingo decorations. One neighbor still had Halloween pumpkins on their porch, in January. But sure, my gnome was the problem. Right. I'll look into that, I said, which was my way of saying I was absolutely not going to do anything about it. Karen narrowed her eyes but didn't push further. Not yet. That would come later. For now, she made a note on her clipboard, gave me one final look of disapproval, and strutted away like she had just issued a royal decree. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I found a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. No postage, no return address, just a folded piece of paper inside typed in Comic Sans because of course it was. Notice of violation. According to Karen's latest decree, my unauthorized lawn ornament was in direct violation of the neighborhood aesthetic, and I had exactly 48 hours to remove it or face further action. Further action? Over a gnome? I sighed, shaking my head. This was exactly the kind of nonsense people joked about when talking about HOAs. But Karen wasn't joking. She took this as seriously as a federal investigation. That same afternoon, I watched as she patrolled the street like a sentry, her arms crossed as she scrutinized people's driveways, fences, and even the spacing between their garbage bins. She wasn't enforcing actual HOA rules. No, she was making up new ones, twisting vague guidelines into her own personal commandments. The neighbors weren't safe either. Tom from next door got a warning about his non-regulation mailbox, which had been there for years. The Johnsons across the street got cited for having their trash cans out too early, even though it was the exact same time as every other house. And poor Mrs. Ramirez, who had lived here longer than anyone, got a note about her overgrown rose bushes, even though they were perfectly trimmed. It was clear. Karen had gone on a full-fledged power trip. The worst part, she acted like she was doing us all a favor. I just want to keep the neighborhood looking its best, she would say, flashing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But it wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. And the moment she realized I wasn't falling in line, she doubled down. One morning, I caught her measuring my grass. I had stepped outside to grab the newspaper when I saw her crouched down near my yard, ruler in hand, squinting at my lawn like she was conducting a forensic investigation. Karen, I called, making her jump. What are you doing? She straightened, brushing off her knees. Your grass is dangerously close to exceeding the 2-inch limit, she said, pointing at the ruler like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom trial. I blinked. Are you serious? She folded her arms. The rules are the rules. We can't have everyone just doing whatever they want. At this point I had two choices. Comply and let her feel victorious, or push back and see just how far she was willing to take this. I chose option 2. I decided to play along, just not in the way Karen expected. The first thing I did was check the actual HOA rulebook. Not Karen's made-up version, but the real, legally binding document. And what do you know? There was nothing about garden gnomes. Not a single word. There was, however, a very specific clause about harassment by HOA members. Interesting. Armed with this knowledge, I started pushing back. But subtly. If Karen wanted to be ridiculous, I could be just as creative. First I moved the gnome. Not off my lawn, of course. That would be giving in. No, I placed it exactly 2 inches from where it originally stood. Just enough to make it clear I was defying her, but not enough for her to claim it was a new violation. Then I took my pettiness a step further. The next morning I saw Karen approaching my yard again, clipboard in hand. Before she could say a word, I held up a tape measure and measured my grass in front of her. 1.9 inches, I announced cheerfully. Totally within regulation. Her eye twitched. She huffed, jotted something down on her clipboard and walked away without another word. That's when I knew I had her rattled. But I wasn't done. I started documenting everything. Every visit, every ridiculous complaint, every time she was caught snooping around. I even installed a doorbell camera just in case. Karen, of course, doubled down. She started issuing official-looking violation notices, not from the HOA itself, but from her own personal stash of printed templates. The problem? She had no actual authority. One afternoon I found yet another notice on my door. This time it claimed that my front door color was unapproved. I smirked. Not only was my door already on the HOA's approved list, but I had a copy of the document to prove it. So I made sure to be outside the next time Karen strutted over. I got your notice, I said, holding up the paper. Good, she replied, arms crossed. You have a week to repaint. I grinned and pulled out the HOA guideline sheet. Funny thing, Karen. My door color is on the approved list. I flipped the page and pointed directly to it. Her face went pale. That must be a mistake, she stammered. Oh no, I said, feigning concern. You wouldn't be making up rules now, would you? That would be against HOA policy. Karen clenched her jaw, spun on her heel and marched away without another word. It was glorious. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't going to take this lightly. And she was about to take things way too far. Word spread fast. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had been dealing with Karen's nonsense. My quiet little act of defiance had become the talk of the neighborhood, and before I knew it, people were choosing sides. On one side there were Karen's loyal followers, the self-righteous few who believed in her crusade for law and order. They nodded in agreement whenever she ranted about how the neighborhood was falling apart because someone dared to plant daisies instead of regulation-approved petunias. On the other side, pretty much everyone else. Tom from next door was the first to speak up. One evening as I was watering my lawn, making sure not to exceed the Karen-mandated water usage time, he strolled over with a smirk. Saw what you did with the gnome, he said. I raised an eyebrow. And? He chuckled. Last week she accused my cat of trespassing. I blinked. Your cat? He nodded. Swore up and down that Whiskers was damaging property. Said she had documented evidence. I laughed. What did you do? Printed out a fake cease and desist letter from the cat. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. More neighbors started sharing their Karen horror stories. The Johnsons, the ones who got cited for early trash can placement? They had security footage showing Karen adjusting their bins herself, just so she could issue them a violation. Mrs. Ramirez, who got fined for her overgrown rose bushes. Yeah, it turns out Karen had been snipping random stems at night just to claim they were unkempt. The best part? The HOA board was getting sick of her too. At the next meeting, Karen arrived with her usual stack of complaints. She dramatically plopped down a binder labeled Neighborhood Offenders. I almost choked on my coffee. She flipped it open, dramatically clearing her throat. We have a problem, she declared, scanning the room like a villain monologuing in a bad movie. Certain residents are refusing to uphold community standards. The HOA president, an older gentleman who looked like he just wanted to enjoy his retirement in peace, sighed. Karen, what exactly are we talking about this time? He straightened. Unauthorized garden decorations. Grass exceeding length regulations. Improper mailbox heights. And general disregard for the integrity of our neighborhood. A silence fell over the room. Then Tom, who had apparently had enough, leaned forward and said, Karen, my cat does not disregard the integrity of the neighborhood. A few muffled laughs. Karen's eye twitched. The HOA president pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, we've had multiple complaints about your behavior. Her mouth opened then shut. I'm just trying to enforce the rules. Rules that don't exist, I added casually. More chuckles. Karen's face turned red. The HOA president sighed. Unless you have actual real violations, I suggest we move on. Karen was fuming. And when people like her start losing control, they do something reckless. I just didn't expect her to go this far. The next morning I woke up to something insane. Karen had taken things to a whole new level. She was standing on my property, not the sidewalk, not the edge of my driveway, on my actual land. And she was measuring it. Ruler in hand, hunched over like some kind of deranged land surveyor, she was dragging her tape measure along my lawn, muttering to herself. I stepped outside, coffee in hand. Karen. She jolted up looking like a raccoon caught in a trash can. I have every right to be here, she snapped, straightening her posture. This is common HOA land. I stared at her. Karen, this is my property. I have the deed. He waved me off. Not possible. This section of land falls under HOA jurisdiction. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I literally own it. Karen was undeterred. I'm going to have to escalate this to the board. Be my guest. She stormed off, muttering something about community standards and ungrateful residents. At that point I knew she was losing it. But I still wasn't prepared for what she did next. Karen called the police. Yes. 911. Over land ownership. I only found out because about 30 minutes later, a very confused police officer showed up at my door. Sir, he started, looking equal parts apologetic and exhausted. We got a call about a trespassing situation. I blinked. Trespassing? The officer sighed. A woman, Karen, claimed you were blocking access to community property. I burst out laughing. Officer, I said, still chuckling, would you like to see my property deed? 5 minutes later, after reviewing the paperwork and listening to my doorbell cam footage of Karen literally admitting she was on my property, the officer rubbed his temples. She really wasted our time for this? Apparently. The cop shook his head. Yeah, she can't do that. And that's when I saw Karen watching from across the street, arms crossed, glaring daggers at us. The officer turned to wave her over, but she bolted inside like a kid avoiding trouble. But it was too late. Because this time Karen had gone too far. I filed a complaint with the HOA and included the police report. And the best part? I wasn't the only one. The entire neighborhood had finally had enough. The Johnsons submitted their security footage of Karen staging violations. Tom filed a complaint about harassment. Mrs. Ramirez came in with receipts about Karen snipping her bushes. Karen had officially lost her grip on the neighborhood. And at the next HOA meeting, she got exactly what she deserved. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread fast. Karen had finally overplayed her hand and people were done. The usual dull meetings where the most exciting thing discussed was fence paint shades, suddenly had standing room only. Karen walked in with her usual overconfident strut, clutching her ever-present binder of complaints. But this time something was different. The HOA president looked pissed. He cleared his throat, shuffling some papers. Before we get started, we need to address some serious complaints regarding one of our members. Karen straightened, looking smug. She clearly thought she was about to see me or maybe Tom get publicly reprimanded for our disrespect of the rules. Then he said her name. Karen, we've received multiple complaints about your conduct, including harassment of residents, fabricating violations and misuse of HOA authority. Karen's face dropped. That's ridiculous, she stammered, clutching her binder like a lifeline. I was just enforcing the rules. The HOA president raised an eyebrow. You called the police over a property dispute? Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. She wasn't expecting that to be brought up so quickly. He continued. We reviewed the footage provided by multiple residents. It's clear that you've been trespassing on private property, altering landscaping without permission, and issuing fake violation notices. A few muffled chuckles from the crowd. Karen's face turned bright red. I know. I was just trying to keep things in order. If I don't enforce the rules, this place will turn into chaos. Tom leaned forward with a smirk. Yeah, we're all real close to anarchy, Karen. Someone in the back snorted. The HOA president sighed. Enough. Effective immediately, Karen, you are removed from any and all HOA decision-making positions. You are no longer permitted to issue complaints or violations on behalf of the board. The room erupted in applause. Karen looked like someone had just unplugged her life support. You can't do that, she sputtered. The HOA president leveled her with a tired, unimpressed look. Oh, we can. And we have. Then just when I thought it couldn't get any better. He flipped to another page in his notes. Furthermore, due to your repeated violations of property rights, the board has issued a formal warning. Any further harassment or trespassing will result in fines or legal action. Karen gasped. Oh, and he added, flipping one last paper with an almost cruel sense of satisfaction, we also found out that your own yard decorations violate the guidelines. I watched as Karen's entire world crumbled. Effective immediately, the president continued, you are required to remove your unapproved holiday lights by the end of the week. Silence. Then Tom, bless his soul, slow clapped. One by one the rest of the room joined in. Karen, now the recipient of her own violation notice, stood there completely speechless. For the first time in her HOA tyrannizing career, she had nothing to say. Karen never quite recovered after that. Oh, she tried. For a few weeks she still strutted around the neighborhood like she was in charge, but everyone knew the truth. She had lost her power, and without it she was just a nosy neighbor with a bad attitude. The best part? She had to take down her beloved holiday decorations. A giant inflatable Santa that violated the height restrictions she swore by. I made sure to take a picture when she deflated it. It was poetic. After that, Karen slowly faded into the background. She still threw the occasional dirty look in my direction, still grumbled about neighborhood standards under her breath, but the days of her clipboard-fueled tyranny were over. The neighborhood thrived. People started talking more, laughing about their Karen war stories. The Johnsons finally left their trash cans out without fear. Tom's cat could roam free without being accused of treason. Mrs. Ramirez's rose bushes? Bigger and better than ever. Me. I kept my garden gnome right where it was. And every time I walked past Karen's house I gave it a little nod, because if that tiny gnome could survive the worst of the HOA apocalypse, so could we.